All right, good afternoon, everybody. Is it that tech folks don't do call and response? Good afternoon, everybody. We want to keep things moving here. My name is Jared Ball. It's an honor and a privilege to moderate the next panel. And I just wanted to say that very quickly, I appreciate Joe Torres and the work he does at Free Press and that organization in general, and the efforts around these particular kinds of conversations, because I think one important value of centering the experience of so-called people of color in any question, issues of privacy or surveillance, supreme among them, is that doing so honestly forces an immediate focus on the imperial and colonizing nature of the state itself. Such an approach lends itself to gaining a view from below, from among the so-called wretched, the subjects of colony and empire. And with that said, I want to welcome our panel. I'm going to keep my contributions relatively short. We're doing our panel session here is Technology, the Internet, and Race, Tools for Liberation or Oppression. Our guests include, to my left, Professor Alvaro Bedoya. He is the founding executive director of the Center Center. What happened to the text there?
On Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law.
Thank you.
Yes.
Prior to joining Georgetown Law, he served as chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Privacy, Technology, and the Law, and to its chairman, Senator Al Franken. In this capacity, he advised Senator Franken in crafting legislation and conducting oversight in mobile location privacy, health data privacy, and NSA transparency, and worked to improve privacy protections for biometric technology like facial recognition and fingerprint readers. We welcome him to the panel. Also to my left is Anika Collier-Navaroli. She is the Data and Civil Rights Project Coordinator for Data and Society Research Institute. She is a journalist, lawyer, and activist. Her areas of research include the laws governing technology and First Amendment jurisprudence, the intersection of intellectual property law and freelance journalism industry. Anika also explores the expansion of traditional constitutional principles governing civil rights protesting to technology and social media, as well as the policy implications stemming from that expansion. Anika works to further open the lines of communication between the technological and civil rights communities. And finally, to my right is Hamid Khan. He is the coordinator of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Based out of Los Angeles, the primary goal of this broad-based coalition is to raise public awareness, participation, mobilization, and grassroots organizing to combat police use of surveillance, spying, and infiltration against targeted and marginalized communities and social movements. The coalition draws its support and base from diverse members of the community, including formerly incarcerated people, students, unhoused folks, youth, LGBTQ community members, artists, immigrants, academics, lawyers, cultural workers, and faith-based and community-based organizations. Hamid is also co-founder and former executive director of South Asian Network. We welcome them and all of you to this panel, and we will start to my left again with Professor Bedoya, responding to the broad general question of how do technology and the internet interact with race? Are they indeed tools for oppression or liberation?
Great, thank you for that introduction, Jared. Hey everyone, I'm Alvaro. I'm going to talk about two substantive points to answer this question, and then one strategy point, which we can expand on later. The first point is that surveillance technology doesn't target everyone equally. It disproportionately targets the weak. It disproportionately targets the unpopular. And so we need to look at privacy as a shield for the weak and as a shield for the unpopular. The second point is that surveillance is often beta tested on vulnerable communities. And we need to start explaining how that happens because I think it will create broader coalitions. And that's the third point. How do we act on this to counter surveillance and to stop it? So on the first point, I think, and I'm aware that I'm kind of preaching to the choir in large part here, but I think a lot of Americans, when they think of surveillance of vulnerable people, they might know Martin Luther King and the vicious surveillance of Martin Luther King by J. Edgar Hoover. What they might not know is that J. Edgar Hoover also surveilled Cesar Chavez and also surveilled the Black Panthers and was critical in the dismantling of that organization. But before J. Edgar Hoover, it was Japanese Americans who were surveilled. And before that, it was W.E.B. Du Bois who was surveilled for trying to go to Europe while Woodrow Wilson was negotiating some pretty lofty principles and point out that a major population in Woodrow Wilson's hometown of the United States was not exactly getting that same fair deal. After all this, it's LGBT service members. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that when unpopular, powerless people meet the gears of government, they tend to lose. And so what privacy is a space that allows them to do that work without powerful forces stopping them. And I think this is a frame that could be useful for us. The second item, surveillance being beta tested on vulnerable communities. So quick story. So I was born in Peru. I came here when I was 5. My grandmother is straight out of a Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel, lives in this old house. It's like crumbling in a little mountain town in northern Peru called Cajamarca. And for years, I think all of us remember when like a long distance call was a really big deal. And for years, we would call my grandmother, and it would be a really bad connection, and it was a really big deal for us. And the fact of the matter is that probably from about 1993 on, every single time my brother and I called our, almost centenarian grandmother in a little mountain town in northern Peru, the Drug Enforcement Administration was making a record of it. And this is kind of the secret history of the 215 program that the folks in this room probably know about, but I don't think the point has been sharpened in this respect. Before 215, the program that allowed the collection of all of our call records all the time was a Drug Enforcement Administration program that logged international calls. They were not international calls to just anywhere. They were international calls to mostly all of Latin America and certain areas elsewhere. And I remember this story coming out and no one making the second beat in that sentence. The first beat being all international calls were logged. The second beat being that probably means if you're a Latino living in the United States, every time you called your mom or your grandmother or your grandfather, anyone back home, the Drug Enforcement Administration was keeping track of that. And so another instance I think you're going to see this is with facial recognition. The FBI has a 50 million strong database of faces that state and local law enforcement can use to identify suspects in photos. Before I left Capitol Hill, my boss, Senator Franken, inserted a request, made a request that would include among an audit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's facial recognition systems, statistics on demographics and on who is in this database. And I suspect what will happen if GAO is able to produce this information is that it won't be an equal representation of all of our communities in that database. That database is going to be disproportionately poor, disproportionately black, and disproportionately Latino. And so I think we need to reckon with this fact. Final point, and then I will close, because I know we just want to do brief statements here. When I was a Senate staffer working on NSA reform legislation, and I know some of you have heard this before because I've said it to you, I noticed something very troubling. And it was this. We had so many hearings about NSA. We had so many hearings. We had hearing after hearing after hearing, and that's wonderful. And each time the administration had to send people, and they'd get yelled at, and they would yell back, and it was a true sort of exchange of ideas as much as you can have in an unclassified setting. One thing that I never heard in any of those hearings, and I could have missed it, but I'm pretty sure I never heard it, was the name Martin Luther King, or was the name Cesar Chavez, or was any bit of this history of disproportionate surveillance of vulnerable communities. And I think that's everyone's loss. I think that's our loss because I think it's everyone's loss because they don't know, but I think it's our loss because our coalition could be all the more stronger the more we have the civil rights community activated and moving alongside with us. I've said this before to someone, and they've said, well, Alvaro, we don't really need the left. We need the right. We need the right to get to 60. And this person was exactly right. You need the right. You need Republicans, and God bless them, and God bless folks that in the Republican Party that are are with us on the surveillance issue. We need those folks to get to 60, but we need the left to make sure that what we get out of that 60 is actually worth something. Because there are amendment votes after amendment votes, and if your coalition is not strong, you will lose those votes, and you will get a far worse product because of it. So looking forward, we have a debate about Section 702, which allows for the surveillance of communications collected in the United States with one end international. And I'm sure I'm getting some tiny piece of that wrong or big piece of that wrong. But in those communications collected are some entirely domestic communications. We now know that. But in those communications are going to be an awful lot of communications by immigrants. And this program does not affect everyone equally. It disproportionately impacts immigrants. It probably disproportionately impacts Latinos. And I think we need to put that forward and talk about that. So I think I'll close there.
Hi, everyone. This isn't on. This on? Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Alvaro, I'm
Yeah,
stealing
please.
your mic.
Yeah,
I'm stealing
please do.
Alvaro's mic.
You're good.
This better? Hey. Hey, everyone. Thanks again for coming. So before I talk a little bit about the surveillance and technology piece, I want to take a step backwards, and I want to talk about the notion of privacy as we currently know it. So the way that we typically think about it in these circles is the philosophical or the legal definitions. And in doing that, I think that we make certain assumptions. And I want to talk a little bit about those assumptions. So first, I think the assumption that we make is that there is agency over one's own body or one's own personhood. And I think the second assumption that we make is that privacy is this thing that exists. And in order to do so, I think that we create a certain privilege. And to say that, I want to say essentially that there are certain communities within the United States who have never had the privilege of what I'm going to define as privacy. So privacy, by privacy, what I'm talking about is non-surveillance or a non-monitoring. And so basically what I'm going to talk about a little bit here is the Black community, just because that's the community that I'm a member of. It's the one I know the best, and it's the one that I've studied the most. So I attended a conference very similar to this a couple months back, hosted by a lot of the same folks. And I went to a panel that was about cybersecurity. So it started with the NSA talks, as Alvaro was talking about, and I think this is one that definitely did it right in discussing the historical impacts and the disparities. And what was shown at the very beginning of this panel was a document that was put up on the screen. And it was a very simple document. And this document was stated to be the very first piece of surveillance within the United States. And what that was a slave pass. And this was, for those of you who don't understand what a slave or don't know what a slave pass is, it was a piece of paper that was given to Black Americans back in the day. And this allowed them to physically move from one confined plantation to another. And without this pass, there was a serious risk of bodily harm and or death. So from the very beginning of Black folks being in America, the physical presence has been monitored and surveilled. And this includes folks that were privileged enough to be free. They had freedmen's passes, and without these, they were not able to move about freely. And as some folks have seen from 12 Years a Slave, that those didn't also work all the time. So just moving back through history, we see from the very, very beginning, the notion of privacy as we know it never existed for Black folks in America. And we can move through history, we end slavery, and then we have physical signs that told folks where they could walk, where they could sit, where they could eat, where they could drink, where they could do the very simple things of life. And again, very physical movements of people being monitored, being surveilled, and not following these signs, again, created a risk of serious bodily harm and or death. This continued. So we go through what Alvaro was talking about. We know about the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We know about MLK. Assata Shakur in her book talks a lot about when she became really big, her autobiography, when she became pretty big in the Black liberation struggle, there was a certain point in which she stopped receiving phone bills, but yet her phone was never disconnected. And that was the moment that she realized that her phone was in fact wiretapped. And again, like now we know what happened. Everything has been declassified. We know about COINTELPRO. We know about J. Edgar Hoover. We know all of these things now. But in those movements, not just the physical movements, but also the social movements of Black people were being monitored. So to me, it's not extraordinary when we think about today's society. And we think about the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is monitoring Black Lives Matter movement activists to things as simple as concerts. It's not extraordinary to me that there are allegations in Chicago of stingray devices being used to monitor the movements of protesters as they move about the streets. These things are not extraordinary in that the existence of privilege, of privacy never existed for Black folks within America, and to this day is not a notion that is really known. And so I kind of want to start my thought process there. And just realize and ground this conversation in the knowledge that when we talk about surveillance, when we talk about technology, we talk about brand new tools for a thing that has always been going on.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Hamid. I'm from Los Angeles with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. I want to start off by just picking up where Anika stopped, where what I gathered was that for many communities, and historically speaking, and even currently as well, privacy is a luxury. It's not really a right. So I think that's something that we need to really just at least acknowledge and put it out there. Secondly, since yesterday, if I was not working on the ground, on the streets, just organizing out in Los Angeles, one would assume that surveillance is purely a federal issue, whereas the local police is completely kept out of the equation most of the time. And when you look at history, before the FBI came into existence, the police red squads were very much in operation. And the police red squads didn't start because the Russians were coming. The police red squad started in the 1880s because of the Haymarket strike in Chicago. That was the formation in 1886. Haymarket happens, 1888, Chicago Police Department is the first department to formally incorporate a section which was going to engage in covert intelligence gathering and surveillance of communities. And from there on, then we see this rapid escalation of the red squads. So local police has always been on the forefront of surveillance, spying, and infiltration. There was conversations around Stingray. There was conversations around automatic license plate readers. The Los Angeles Police Department has all of these tools. We talk about fusion centers. The Los Angeles Police Department has its own internal fusion center as well. New York Police Department works closely with the CIA. So the point I'm trying to raise is that locally, law enforcement agencies have been on the front lines of surveillance, spying, and infiltration. Which brings me to the point then how does it impact our communities, and particularly communities of color? And most of the time, the conversation starts from impact rather than core concepts. Like, okay, well, this is what has happened, without us backtracking and seeing that what has been the history behind this thing. Another thing that Anika raised was that this is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. So Bill Bratton is known all around the world, not just in the United States, as one of the top cops. I mean, as much as bogus propaganda there is. And Bill Bratton is really the one who pushed the broken windows theory. So I just want to ask Paul if you can open that Word document from Edward Banfield. No, the other one, just the Word document, not this thing. This one. So if you can, Edwards Banfield was the intellectual guru of James Q. Wilson, who was one of the co-authors of the infamous Broken Windows article in The Atlantic in 1982, which was co-authored by George Kelling. And this is what set the tone for where Broken Windows was informed. So can somebody read this real loudly? Go ahead. Somebody read it. Go ahead, Joe.
The implication that lower class culture is pathological seems fully warranted. Rather than waste time and public money implementing policies based on the false notion that all men were created equal, better to just face facts and acknowledge.
If you can scroll it down.
Acknowledge that natural divisions that exist. Members of the lower classes should leave school in the 9th grade to get a jump on a lifetime of manual labor. The minimum wage should be repealed to encourage employers to create more jobs for lower value labor. The state should give intensive birth control guidance to the incompetent poor, and the police should feel free to crack down on younger, lower-class men?
So then the police should feel free to crack down on young lower-class men. This is the origin of broken windows policing, which leads to, can you open up the other one, Paul? That one from Countdown? Yeah. So this is the tally as of yesterday, how many people have been murdered by law enforcement in the United States as of 2015. 902 already. This is a tally that got started by The Guardian. It's called Counted. And when you do the math, every 7 hours and 36 minutes, someone is being murdered by law enforcement. I mean, if we just pause there for a second, every 7 hours, today as we sit here, more than 3 people on an average will be killed by law enforcement. And look at the numbers. Los Angeles leads that, 18 already in 2015. When you look at per million, 5.2 for blacks per million, 2.4 to Hispanic Latino per million, 2.1 white. So 250% is the disparate impact on the black community that how law enforcement is murdering them. How is the law enforcement responding when we go in protest? Can you go to the next slide, please? This is what we look at. This is what we are facing. This is the intense militarization of the police. This is when we go out on the street. This is how we are met. This is how we are brutalized. So when somebody talk about privacy and then people talk about hacking, that's the previous slide showed that how families are being hacked, how their spirits are being hacked, how trauma is being created, and what is going out on the streets of Los Angeles. And the last couple slides I just want to show, if you want to go to the third one, this is now happening. North Dakota is the first state in the country that has now authorized law enforcement use of drones with non-lethal weapons, as if tasers and rubber bullets had never killed people. And lastly, I just want to show you a slide. This is what we are facing. This is the LAPD's architectural surveillance, something that we know that. From fusion centers to the suspicious activity reporting program to see something, say something, to the intelligence gathering guidelines where they can legitimately now place informants in political groups, where they can also, the cops can take fictitious personas and fake identities to friend you on social media. Then you look at predictive policing, you look at trapwire technology, which is a street camera that picks up your body image and immediately transmits to fusion centers, to Stingray. And then somebody was saying that Stingray is not going to be used because now they're using dirt boxes, the digital receiver technology, which is Stingray on steroids. And then you move into the automatic license plate readers, drones, high-definition cameras. The DHS memo, basically, and this is what leads to that how policing and surveillance of poor communities, because my work is based out of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, where gentrification is running rampant. And one of the things this memo said was that it took 3 small cases of low-level arson, and they put a memo out that if there's any housing rights activist, if there's any rally or anything going on, that should be considered a suspicious activity, and a suspicious activity report should be filed on housing rights activists. And then you go to the militarization, Joint Terrorism Task Force, and fusion centers. And I want to end by saying that as we are looking at this, who ultimately is going to pay the price? I mean, when you look at the murders on the street, the most recent audit of the Los Angeles Police Department suspicious activity reporting, 2 years in a row, came out that these are counterterrorism programs. Most of the police now is heading towards counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, that of all the SARs that were sent to fusion centers, over 31% of them were filed on Los Angeles' black community, a community that is less than 10% of the population, a 3-to-1 disparate impact. In the gender count, 50% of these SARs were open on black women. Now, these are counterterrorism programs. Lastly, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department has now become the largest repository of biometrics. They have now a database that they can gather biometrics on 15 million subjects, and that is an extension of the U.S. military, Navy, and Marine program called the Identity Dominance System, which started in Afghanistan, where they had basically taken everything of the whole population of Afghanistan, and now as of this month they're launching into the second phase, which is called the IDS-2, Identity Dominance System, where they're going to start looking at a person's gait, how you walk, how you move your hands and your arms. So in essence, what we are seeing is now that speculative policing is going on to the next level, because what this is all is, it's all speculative policing, and it's being legitimized like that. So I'll stop right there.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. And particularly to that, as Chappelle once said, that delicious bit of racism you share with us. We don't get racism, sophisticated racism on display that much in 2015. I really appreciate that. That was magnificent. That was, it was fantastic. Before we open this up to our guests in the audience here, I did want to give a moment or two for anyone on the panel to respond or question to anything that they've heard from another panelist. Does anybody want to invite an elaboration? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make one point, and I know that we all know this, but I just want to put it out there for everyone. Technology in and of itself is not the problem. We all know that, but I just want to put that out there. It is how it's being implemented. It's the policies around it. I can say this very, very personally because I recently found out that my brother builds Stingray devices, so that's really fun family conversations. But, you know, he's a black man in America with a good job and a daughter to feed, so you gotta take them, and again, technology in itself is not evil. The end. Thanks.
Anybody else?
Just one quick comment on that yes, it may not be a problem, but what we are being sold is this claim that technology is race neutral.
That's true.
So I think we need to really at least acknowledge that no, it is not race neutral. It's garbage in, garbage out. That's what predictive policing is based on, existing reports of crime, and who's going to get hosed as a result of that, what communities are going to be under siege. These are going to be traditionally black and brown communities, traditionally poor communities, because a quality of life crime, a survival crime is now put in, and next thing you know, these boxes are created. So when people talk about predictive policing and when people talk about Stingray, it's very clear that yes, technology may be built with the intent, but the impact is completely different. So, it is not race neutral per se, because it's applied very much in a racist manner.
And in some ways, I would just want to add, I mean, it's almost, in a sense, worse to the extent that I think social media and technology in general are encouraged as, or the claims that are encouraged are often around that they are not only that they're race neutral, but that they are a benefit, that they're leveling the playing field, that they're increasing democracy and equality, and I think that should be questioned as well. So I'll turn it over to our audience participants, guests. Anybody with a question or comment? I think over here.
Thanks very much. You've been talking about the front end of our incarceration system, which is imprisoning more people per capita than I think any other nation. I think perhaps there are a few small countries that we've surpassed along those lines, or we're co-equal with along those lines. What I'm asking about in terms of that incarceration system, if we could just unpack who's involved in it, the third parties who run those jails. Very often we've got individuals who run those jails, whatever companies that run those jails that are making profits. If those beds are not filled in those prisons, I see some people want to riff on this. If those beds aren't filled, the states, whatever, the localities have to compensate those prisons for the companies that run the prisons for those losses. And I'm just wondering if we can somehow expose what's happening along those lines. I know that's more of a media problem and a communications problem along those lines than anything else, but there's still this notion that a lot of us have that the prisons are run by the state, in effect, and the fact that, in effect, we're being burdened as taxpayers, as people, community members, with supporting a third-party system that is basically bilking us for so much money along those lines.
So actually, if someone wants to talk about the incarceration third parties, please go ahead. I have a related issue that I think you'll find interesting, but yeah, okay. 100% agree with you. That's a huge problem. I don't know enough about the commercial entities that privatize jails and make money off of people being in jail, which is horrific. But I can tell you one thing, and I'm sorry this podium's like perfectly positioned to make it impossible for me to look. Okay, I'm going to look at you through the screen here. No, that's just me. Okay. One point here that's going on with facial recognition and the commercial vendors around facial recognition is very interesting. And this is paid for by U.S. taxpayers. So in the commercial setting of facial recognition, there's lots of reasons to be terrified. And I say that a little tongue-in-cheek. There's lots of reasons to be really concerned, right? But the interesting thing that you have in commercial facial recognition is a balkanization of algorithms. So Facebook has their own algorithm, Google has their own algorithm, Apple has their own algorithm. And so you could trade photos and then they could produce their own face prints, but you can't really trade face prints, right? And in fact, in this negotiation that we just had a couple months ago, this kept on being raised as, yeah, if somebody hacks my face prints, it's no good for anybody. They don't have our system. It's proprietary. And if the private facial recognition industry is characterized by balkanization, the government facial recognition industry is characterized by centralization. There is one company that registers, I think, 1 billion people in India. There is one company that enrolls people with e-passports in Albania, and it's that same company that I believe is the vendor for FBI's facial recognition program, and it's that same company that enrolls you in PreCheck, for TSA PreCheck. That is one entity, and that is one entity that we pay with taxpayer dollars. And so, and I don't know. I think it's an open question as to what that means for us. And so I think it's an excellent point. We need to look at the taxpayer money that is going to support these systems. One of the easiest things to do legislatively, easier than passing a bill that tells X person to do Y thing, is a bill that says you can't spend X money on Y thing, a rider of sorts. And so I haven't seen this successfully done. Other people in the room may correct me as to, oh no, we did that. So I've seen amendments that have gone part way, but I haven't seen one go the whole way. And so I'm sure someone in the room will correct me that happened a couple years ago. But I think that's an excellent pressure point, and that's something we need to watch.
Sure.
So just picking up on that, I don't think anybody surpasses per capita the United States. I mean, the level of incarceration that is. But I think one of the things that circle of LAPDs love that I was showing there is that there's a way that where artificial ways of contact are being created. And this is how it is. The Suspicious Activity Reporting Program, for example, which is now, as of GAO, Government Accountability Office report from early 2003, like 14,200 local law enforcement agencies had already incorporated that. 300 DOD, Department of Defense entities had incorporated that. So how do they even define suspicious activity? Let's look at that. And I quote directly from the Director of National Intelligence's definition that suspicious activity is observed behavior reasonably indicative of pre-operational planning of terrorist and or criminal activity. So when you think about it, observed behavior, reasonably indicative, that I'm observing somebody's behavior, it reasonably indicates of pre-operational planning that you may be thinking of doing something wrong in the future. So now speculative policing, so now that point, so in Los Angeles, we really looked at it when Ezell Ford was murdered. That when Ezell Ford was killed by law enforcement, what was the intersection between suspicious activity reporting, predictive policing, and gang injunctions? And when you have all of these things, so what you're looking at is future mass incarceration as well, which doesn't end, which communities of color are going to be the mass recipient of that. And then when you look at the trajectory of the war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on terror, the war on immigrants, so it's not just like, that you're actually in, it's almost like, maybe it's not as bad as what the Palestinians are going through, which is an open-air prison, but yet at the same time, you may not be incarcerated in a prison, but you're living a life of internment. You're constantly living a life of internment. You got put in a gang database, you're living a life of internment. You are an undocumented immigrant, you are living a life of internment. If you happen to be of a particular ethnicity or something, you're living a life of internment. So I think we need to really push ourselves, that when we talk about mass incarceration, we need to be looking at these mass concentration of internment that we look. And as an immigrant myself coming from Pakistan, I mean, one thing earlier on as South Asian Network, we put this report out, which was From Displacement to Internment, which really looked at the lives of immigrants of a particular ethnicity as how they're living their lives.
Nika, did you have anything?
I'm good.
I just wanted to add very quickly to this point about this question of third parties that the brilliant MC out of Queens, New York, Homeboy Sandman, wrote an article a couple of years ago, which is one of the best I've seen, connecting the dots between private equity groups who invest both in major media entertainment companies and private prison companies like the Corrections Corporations of America, making the point that there is this incestuous relationship between promoting certain images and encouraged behavior of primarily black and brown people that then justifies their imprisonment and increasing mass incarceration. So it's I would encourage people to check check for him on that as well. Off the top of my head, I don't remember but you can find it in a great interview we did with him at imixwhatilike.org. And then we link there to the article. Somewhere in there is, Homeboy Sandman is his name, out of Queens, New York. You should also check out his music. I mean, he's an incredible artist. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Yes, see in the middle here.
So I think Alvaro's absolutely right in pointing out that the NSA debate over the last couple of years, we really did not hear anything on all the hearings on the Hill on issues of racially motivated surveillance or malicious use of surveillance tools in the context of our discussion of NSA surveillance, and that was to our detriment. But I do remember hearing a lot during those hearings, both from the intelligence community and from a lot of members of Congress, how, you know, there have never been any instances of misuse of the bulk collection program. And for the 702 programs and other types of surveillance, there have been maybe 6 isolated cases of analysts on their own, you know, spying on a former romantic partner, but that being the extent of abuse in those programs. And more generally, a lot of discussion of, you know, NSA and the intelligence community are hardworking, and the people there care about the rules and regulations that they're required to follow, and that we should be giving them credit for the work they do to keep the country safe and not trying to villainize or demonize them. And, you know, I think that those two items are naturally going to come up if you have any type of discussion to what we're talking about here in the context of debates about NSA surveillance in the future. So I'm curious, what would you all think is the best way to respond to that issue?
I have a couple thoughts, Jake. So, first of all, I think misuse, abuse, and use are a lot more similar in our eyes than I think the NSA's eyes. What the heck do I mean by that? So, the breadth of the NSA authorities is so substantial that so much of what they do legally does not qualify as misuse or abuse, right? You can just look at Executive Order 12333 and which I think the intelligence community says this is a limited authority, and you look at the limits, it's like for any, you know, foreign intelligence purpose, for any terrorist purpose, for any drug enforcement purpose, and it's just like, what purpose isn't here? And the only purpose that isn't there is love int, right? Is literally, you know, analysts looking up their boyfriend or girlfriend, or, you know, want to be boyfriend or girlfriend, and then figuring out what they're doing. And so I think the sample set we've got back when Senator Grassley rightly asked the intelligence community, you know, give us the instances of intentional misuse, only represent a little bit of what all of us would look at and say, no, that was wrong. You shouldn't have done that. And so that is one thing. The other thing that I think is really important is that I think we are too frequently stuck in this 1984 mentality where we expect the people watching us to be bad. You know, we expect them to have ill intent, you know, and to just be really, you know, terrible people. When A, that only hurts in negotiations with the intelligence community, and B, it's not true. And in fact, I think it's far more difficult to. I mean, there's a Brandeis quote on this. I mean, our which I'm going to butcher, but it's like, you know, we are naturally attuned to stop, you know, evil men. Our democracy is the true risk comes from. What is it? Men full of zeal. You know, you can look it up. But basically, he's saying that we need to be worried about people who think they're good, and frankly, who are good in their own, from the framework they're operating from. And so, I think it's helpful to move away from the world where the intelligence community is the bad guy and just they're just the people that totally disagree on how to protect our country and engaging them on that. And to speak, one last thing I'll say is I think the senators in Capitol Hill, there's so many strategies. One is just to be the outsider, you know, throwing the bombs in, and there's a real value to that. But there's another side to it where you say, listen, I respect what you do. You know, I think you guys are patriots, and I think you're great. You know, you're great civil servants. But we got to sit down and talk about what you're doing because you know, we disagree on X and Y and Z, and each of those strategies gets you different things, and you need to have both of those strategies in place to be successful.
Is this working? Hey, it's working again. So what Alvaro was saying about intentional misuse, this actually brings me back to my journalism days and thinking about the blanket excuse, the blanket, not an excuse, but the term of things jeopardizing national security in the reason for not printing. So I think that there is a very distinct legal definition of what would be considered abuse or misuse, and then there is the definition that we all might see as not necessarily legal, but not okay. So I think that those are like the muddy waters between the two, and we understand them. Everyone else might not necessarily understand them. And to your second point, I can speak to this personally, again, because my brother makes Stingray devices. And so I think that there's the piece of realizing that people are people, and while we can sit here and we can paint the intelligence community as the bad guys, in reality, they're doing their jobs. And I think that once we start having those open-ended conversations and explaining to them, because a lot of what we do at Data and Society is talking to technologists and saying, this is a really bad idea because of X, Y, and Z. And a lot of times that's the very first time that people have ever heard the civil rights implications of this technology that they're creating and why it is actually, in fact, a really bad idea. So I think opening the lines of communication and saying that, yes, this is a cool toy and I understand why you might understand with your privilege why this is a really good thing, but you have to think about the marginalized populations. You have to think about the unintended consequences. You have to think about all of these things. So I think it's about opening the lines of communication between the thing and then the process and then the end effect.
I have a little different take on that. I'm reminded of two titles. One is this book that came out several years ago, Tyranny of the Bottom Line, How Corporations Turn Good People into Bad. And there's another paper that came out of Cornell, which was The Black, White, and Blue Cop. So which basically means that, you know, it's not about diversity in the police department, it's about institutional prerogatives. It's a uniform, it's what it dictates, it's what it demands what you to do. So we can sit here all day long and yeah, I mean, like, you know, I have friends, I mean, I have family members who are cops as well. They may not be bad people, they have children and the Russians have children too, kind of thing. But the point here being that institutional prerogatives, and if we were to ask this question with folks in Skid Row on 6th and Gladys or the youth on Florence and Normandy, or East LA and Boyle and First, based on what was said earlier about where police originally is based on slave catching, on enforcing segregation codes, on enforcing Jim Crow, and on and on and on, then what we see is that it's flawed by design. And when something is flawed by design, then I think to expect that to operate in a different way I would say would be a stretch itself. Yes, there are good people who may want to do good things, but the results are completely different. And we can't we can't look at it in a human context. We have to look at it in the institutional context, because once that uniform is on, then that is all of LAPD that is being carried through. Once that suit is put on, then it's the institutional prerogative of the FBI that is being carried on as well. Once they're tapping into somebody, then what the NSA demands institutionally to serve as a purpose, that is what is going on as well. So I think when we think of these things, and that's what's maybe what I was feeling since yesterday, was that a lot of the conversation, quite frankly, that was going on was really removed as to what the lived experience on the street is. Because the conversation was anchored into reform, the conversation was anchored into tinkering around the edges, and that is what we are seeing. But while the conversation is happening on the federal level, the impact is very local in nature. So I think unless we really start incorporating those sentiments, those experiences of what is going on, we talked about the impact on the communities, we showed these slides, it's not just something pulling out of thin air. So I think this conversation needs to be really anchored into people's lived experiences, and then we'll see that whether NSA would do the right thing or not, because history has shown that the institution is not capable of doing that.
Forgive me for extending the editorializing I was trying to do in my introductory remarks, and I know I'm moderating here and I'm not a panelist, but I think it's extremely mistaken to assume that the process that began with enslavement, surveillance of the enslaved, surveillance of those who are deemed to be oppressed, surveillance of those who are in struggle against that oppression, ends at some point, and becomes, again, just sort of an accidental process of a genuinely, a generally honest democracy. My references to imperialism and colonialism are meant to, to suggest, if not, well, more than suggest, to state that these inequalities, that racial oppression and wealth inequality are not accidental occurrences. They are intended outcomes of a process. So this assumption that yeah, the individual analyst she or he may very well be just accidentally performing their duties, but the institution for which they are working does have a decided goal here, a project here, and largely in part to protect the wealth of a racial and class elite. Anyway, we did get some help here. The article I couldn't recall is called Jailhouse Rock, ROC, that is, The Facts About Hip Hop and Prison for Profit. And again, the author is Homeboy Sandman, who is as brilliant an MC as he is a journalist and writer here. Yes, sir, we have another question or comment over here.
Awesome panel, thank you. That was really interesting, the conversation around that and how there's clearly, like, on the one hand, a desire to be, I guess, fair to all parties involved and have empathy where it's appropriate, but also, like, not let that get in the way of a critique that really, like, calls out the racist colonial nature of government and how that's carries through to today. But I feel like maybe they're both true, and like there's a lot of people who are involved in these programs that are inherently oppressive, like at the NSA doing surveillance or whatever, who are legitimately well-intentioned and could sort of be said to be participating in the oppression by accident. And then there's also people who are really not doing it by accident, and those people are more likely to be at the top. And I'm just wondering about, like, if there's any analysis that you all can provide. Like, I mean, am I totally off base? Or, like, I wouldn't be surprised if, like, obviously at the NSA, for example, probably most of the people who are employed there are white men. And I would venture that the higher up you go in the power structure, the higher the concentration of white men is. So, like, I'm wondering about, like, when we're trying to think about the individual moral and personal motivations of the people in these programs, like, what role is there to play for increasing diversity of opinion and demographics in them, and especially, like, how do we think about that in terms of the hierarchy of the organization? So kind of a broad question, but any way you guys would like to respond to that.
Anybody want to jump out on that?
Yeah, I can talk all day long, but I'll go ahead.
You start.
Okay, well, so as a community organizer and, just for the last 30 years in Los Angeles, working with diverse communities, South Asian communities, organizing taxi workers in Los Angeles, and now building a grassroots movement against surveillance, spying, and infiltration. I mean, for us, the answers are not at the top. The answers are at the bottom. And from the bottom up, the answers have to be, those are our guides, and that's what we have to follow. And those answers don't lie in a political analysis. I mean, the policy analysis. They don't lie in theoretical analysis. They lie in real lived experiences of people every day. Every day, that how they are being brutalized, how they are being surveilled, what is happening to a single parent who's on welfare, how he or she is being told that when she goes to renew her public benefits, goes to renew her food stamps or her EBT card, she's being told, why did you go shop at this corner store, how she's being surveilled, how bodies are being tracked and traced and then controlled, so how these tools of social control are taking place. So I think the shift needs to be, and this is one of those, I wouldn't say the last sort of issues, and that is one of the goals for the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, but that it's time that we take it out of the court system. It's time that we take it out, and I say it with respect, out of the ACLUs and the EFFs and various of these national organizations, and we start doing grassroots organizing. Because if we are building an immigrant rights movement, if we are building a housing rights movement, if we are building a sexual rights movement, if we are building a gender justice movement, a racial justice movement, then it's time that we need to build a movement around surveillance, spying, and infiltration. And then we'll see that how do we speak to the people on the top, because then the equation will change. Because right now, as it stands, the equation is very much hovering into these very narrow scopes of conversation that, okay, what is a compromise can we do? What is it going to happen happened with the 702, but the impact of 702 at the end of the day that is extremely dramatic to those communities, which is not just through law enforcement, because what we are looking at these things as tools of social control. Every aspect of our life, all we are constantly traced, tracked, and watched and shared. So information gathering, information storing, information sharing becomes a key piece. So for at least for myself and many of the folks that, my comrades and colleagues whose work is remarkable, whose work I'm carrying in this conversation, our answers don't lie at the top. Our answers lie where the power is, and that's in the people. So that's what we are doing in Los Angeles.
Anybody else?
Yeah, so I think that a piece of what you're discussing is kind of this tension, what you said, between the fairness and empathy versus this colonialism and imperialism idea. And I will say if that tension didn't exist, folks like me wouldn't have jobs. Because that is what I grapple with every single day. So there are these ideas of working within the systems that we currently have while also realizing that the systems were set up against me to fail. And so without that tension and being able to work within those systems and try and create some sort of pieces of reform until I can work myself out of a job, that's essentially what it is that I do, the way that I think about this work, and the way that I come to this work. And it's a lot of what Ahmed's saying as well, in the idea that we need to open up I keep saying this, open up the lines of conversation between those on the ground and the real life stories and what's actually happening, and the community organizers who know what is actually happening, and bring that all the way to the top. Because without it, we're essentially lost. And we can talk about it and we can talk for people as much as we want to, but until we're talking to the people and the people are speaking for themselves, basically our work is useless.
One other note to add that I think puts part of the blame on us too is, not only is the leadership of NSA homogenous and the leadership of the intelligence community homogenous, the folks overseeing them are homogenous as well. Black people and Latinos comprise 1/3 of the nation's population and yet represent, like 1/30th of the United States Senate. What's more, most of the blacks and Latinos in the Senate are Republicans. If you think about yesterday's debate, if you just stop what everyone's saying and just compare it to what it looks like compared to the Republican debate, the Democrats aren't doing too well. Everyone could have more women on there, but the Republican side of the slate is more diverse than our slate. And I think that's a problem that I don't want to assume everyone in this room is a progressive, because hopefully we've got some conservatives in the room. But we conservatives have a real problem where we think because, we're good on these issues, clearly our policies are going to help, black and Latino people. We do not make concerted efforts to put these individuals in positions of leadership. And so I think we would have a different outcome if you'd had more United States senators who were black, who were Latino, who were Arab American, or any senator who was Arab American. I'm not aware of one. Maybe there is. And so I think part of the blame is on us.
So I saw a hand over here.
Hi. As an advocate and representative of the Latino community in Western Pennsylvania, I have a question, or I guess I want to know your point of view as of what role will surveillance and facial recognition play in immigration reform, because that's a hot topic right now in our presidential debate, and our lovely Donald Trump was so kind to bring that on. So I would like to know where do you think this will go, and what role facial recognition will play as people come in the country or are in the country already, as they talk about immigration reform.
So a couple quick thoughts. One of the interesting parts of immigration reform, so there's two places where this comes in, and I'm sure there's many more, but I'll just point out two. The first is entry into the country, and that's kind of already done. So I've started noticing when I come back in the country, a photo is taken of me, and what occurs there is, I'm pretty sure, it's face recognition for verification purposes. Your image is compared to that in your passport, and either a yes or no is produced. And so that's going to occur no matter what. What's going to come with immigration reform is a whole series of verification. Right now, let's say you want to hire me for a job. You give me an I-9, I fill it out. In theory, I come and I show you some documents, but it's all kind of taken on good faith that the documents I'm showing you are real and you're acting in good faith. And so if you see my documents, they look kind of fake, you're like, I don't know about those documents. Let's pass on that. In the future, immigration reform will require some kind of actual employment verification mechanism. And to date, we have so far resisted we have sometimes successfully resisted, other times not resisted, verification methods that require biometrics like face recognition. But I think there's a very high risk, depending on how these dice shake out in the next immigration reform effort, that moment where I show you my I-9 becomes a moment where I stand in front of a camera and the biometric implanted in my card is compared to my face, or my fingerprint, et cetera. So I think that is a very big thing that might happen. And we should pay attention to the vendors that are providing that technology, how they use it. But I think that's a pressure point.
Yeah, so one added piece to this, a lot of the work that I do is not just necessarily looking at one piece of technology, but technology as a whole and what that essentially means. And so what Alvaro, touching a little bit on what he's saying, part of my work is trying to figure out the larger scheme of the biometrics industry and how that relates to surveillance. So little pieces like facial recognition and how they tie into things like body cameras and how they tie into programs like Spit and Acquit that's happening out in LA, and how that program in and of itself disproportionately affects communities of color because they're the ones being pulled over, they're the ones being told, you spit in this cup, we get your DNA, and you can go. But what does that mean when the DNA is collected and then it's matched with facial recognition software and then it's matched with whatever software we come out with next? So I think that we need to start looking at it again as like a bigger picture and figuring out how everything fits in together, and I think that you really touched on that.
If I could just ask, since we only have a few minutes left, if Hamid, if you had any response to that particular question, please offer it. But if I could just ask everyone to give a short summation as we get ready to wrap up, and I'll sort of preemptively thank you all for your time and consideration.
Sure. I said a lot, so I'll try to be short here. If there's one point I want to come across here, it's that the victims of discrimination are disproportionately from certain communities, and those who suffer most and those who suffer disproportionately are frequently from underrepresented communities. And unless we start telling that story, we are not going to get as much as we could get in this debate. And story is a key word there. The anecdote is an almost frightening power on Capitol Hill. It's often, even frustratingly so, even more so than data. If you have a good story, that is what you need to win. And the worst and hence, strangely enough, best stories on surveillance have to do with the leaders of minority and immigrant communities in this country. And I think we'll just be stronger once we start telling them more. And actually, there's lots of people in the room who are working on doing that. But if those folks get help and we can do that more, I think we're going to be so much the stronger for it.
Thank you all again for coming. And I just want to close with a couple thoughts. One is that I think that we need to continue to ground this conversation that we're having in history and in reality. And that goes back to understanding the roots of what these technologies are in essentially policing and understanding the imperialism and the colonial aspects of what they are, and moving forward and creating our notions of privacy and creating our policies around those ideas. And in that, making sure that we are talking to community organizers, that we're talking to people on the ground, that we're creating policies for the people with the people involved, and not speaking for people. And so I think that we need to, again, open up those lines of communication, keep talking, and keep pressing forward to the point that we all work ourselves out of jobs.
And again, thank you for the invite. Just a couple quick thoughts as to what has worked for us in Los Angeles in grassroots organizing around surveillance, spying, and infiltration. Three key principles. One was that this is not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. Secondly, we need to completely debunk and demystify this rhetoric of national security and bring it down to 24/7 policing. Thirdly, there's always an other attached to it to criminalize and to justify through these systems of knowledge and structures of power. I mean, historically speaking, how our faces have been paraded through history, the native, the savage native, the criminal black, the illegal Latino, the manipulative Asian, the terrorist Muslim, and then, LGBTQ community, transgendered folks, and on and on and on, which then justify these laws, so we need to build power. And couple quick things that successes, I wouldn't even call it successes, just one step, that at least since May of last year, because of the grassroots movement, not because of any advocacy or city council or something, it's been people power that has kept LAPD's drones grounded. They have not taken off, at least for the last 16 months. They're still grounded. Secondly, we have forced the LA City's Human Relations Commission to hold public hearings on these programs. So I think for me, the message always is that, ultimately it's going to be the people who's going to have to dismantle it, because there's no other way, as my friend Shakil Syed always says, that you can reform it, you can tinker it, you can take a little bit of poison out. Otherwise, well, if you may do that, but it'll slowly kill you in the long run. So we got to dismantle it. Thank you.
To the Latina sister, you know Donald Trump loves you. Tell the truth, man. No, of course. Just very quickly, I would just want to add, technology doesn't change attitudes. It emanates from attitudes, would be my answer to that question. Thank you all. Thanks to the panelists. And as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So thanks, everybody. Peace.